In the spring of 1995, I was in Paris to interview the United States Ambassador to France, Pamela Harriman. This was to be her first and only British television interview. I wasn't there to discuss Franco-American relations in the era of Mitterrand and Clinton. Instead, it was to capture the ambassador's memories of spending the Second World War in Downing Street as the daughter-in-law of the British Prime Minister, when she was known as Pamela Churchill.
He was, at that time, the voice of Britain. I mean, he had the capacity to make people believe that this was what they thought, this was what they felt. I mean, he made Britain rise to its greatest moments. And it was because he had that enormous quality of being able to empower you with his beliefs.
Ambassador Harriman, can you establish for us where you were during the war?
Well, at the beginning of the war, I was working for the Women's Voluntary Services, WVS. And then, after America came into the war, I ran with Barbie Agar the Churchill Club, which was a club in the precincts of Westminster Abbey, Ashburnham House. And the idea behind it was that it would be a meeting place for American and Canadian officers and men on their time off in London to come and meet their equivalents, their associates. Because it was really playing for people who were professionals, doctors, lawyers, professors. And it was a club that also did, we had lectures, we had musical evenings. In fact, Sir Kenneth Clarke was one of the people that when one of the speakers didn't turn up, we had Sir Kenneth Clarke as a sort of in-house professor. And of course we had all the members of the cabinet, Anthony Eden, they all came. And so it was quite a center for Americans during the war.
Did you find it easy to get on with those figures, people like Eden?
Oh yes, yes. I mean, you know, I think one of the things, I was 19 and there was no sense of age difference. I mean, quite often when my mother-in-law was tired on a weekend at Chequers, I would do hostess for her. And it never seemed strange that I was only 19 and entertaining Lord Wavell or General de Gaulle or General Marshall. It seemed perfectly normal.
How did Churchill strike you during the war?
He was the most wonderful man, and he was the most wonderfully strong, resolute, and yet understanding human being that you can imagine. And the war was long, there were many bad moments in it, and he was also often despondent, but never once did he show any sign of worry about the ultimate outcome.
In those moments of despondency, did you feel the despondency?
Yes, because, you know, remember the communications were so different, and we learned things slowly, and the loss of ships in the Atlantic, and then Dieppe, and there were many very, very dangerous and bad moments. And I think today people think that Churchill was always the leader that everybody looked to, but there were moments in the war when he would go to the House of Commons and there was a lot of criticism leveled at him. It wasn't smooth sailing ever.
You must be one of the very few people that were very close to Churchill, but also had met Adolf Hitler. Can you tell me how Hitler struck you when you met him?
I was at school in Munich, and on a Friday afternoon, Hitler used to go to a hotel. I think it was Hotel Angleterre, I forget. And we were invited, a whole lot of British girls, to have tea there with him. But already, I think that our antennas were up, and we could hear the goose stepping of the soldiers, and he seemed to me a metallic and very unsavory character.
Moving on to the end of the war, what were your personal feelings? Obviously, with Hitler committing suicide, it was a foregone conclusion what was going to happen. But what were your feelings coming into VE Day itself?
Well, they were so mixed. And I think, you know, after almost 6 years of war, the relief of knowing that you weren't going to hear the sirens anymore, that you weren't going to have to rush your baby down to the cellar, that you weren't going to hear the putt-putt of the awful V-1s coming across the sky almost at your level. And that was obviously an enormous relief, but almost at the same time was the realization that for 6 years your life had belonged to the war, and you reacted, you didn't act in a sense, and suddenly you were going to have to grapple with your own life, what it was going to do, how you were going to handle it. For us who hadn't completed our education, there were so many thoughts, and also the momentum for the end of the war had been growing. And I think the final days, the frustration, I remember going down to Downing Street, and my father-in-law, Winston, he wanted to get on with it. And there were all the troubles of getting Stalin to agree to the time, to getting President Truman to agree, and it really got, as you know, the Prime Minister had his speech written and ready to deliver 36 hours before it finally was allowed to happen. And then I remember very much that he was already thinking about the immediate future. I mean, he was talking about the poisonous politics and the international rivalries which would still exist and would go on. Of course, he had to have a big decision-making about the elections, and there was a lot of controversy as to whether they should be immediate or whether they should wait. And of course, Japan was still in the war. So he was already trying to grapple with very grave problems. And I believe that he was always ahead of the game, and he was always thinking of how things could be bettered. I think he was worried for the Poles. I think he was always worried about Stalin. You know, they'd been our allies in wartime, but Stalin's real basic beliefs were so different from ours.
So in a way, his speech on VE Day, we may allow ourselves a brief period of enjoyment, very much reflected his own mood. He wanted to move on.
Oh yes, and I think he saw that there were many. Well, it wasn't so long afterwards when he made the Iron Curtain speech, but he knew that there were clouds on the horizon.
What was the atmosphere like in London at the end of the war?
It was total euphoria, and people were moving around. I remember going down the mall with my son to watch the King and Queen on the balcony, and with Winston Churchill, of course. My mother-in-law was in Russia at the time. It was an emotion that was sort of, it's not possible. Has it really happened? You know, because all through the war we kept ourselves going, saying, one day we will win. But the fact that it had happened, it was almost an anticlimax. And you felt that you were sort of suspended, that this couldn't be real. It was something that I guess we'd all wanted so much for so long. The fact that there we were in the mall outside Buckingham Palace, looking up at that veranda and seeing the King and the Queen and Winston there. I think I felt most of all enormous relief for him, because of all human beings, he had taken it on himself, really, to make the hard decisions. And you know, to have to send young men to their death is, as he used to say, a grave responsibility.
I think it was Lady Soames that said that Churchill was quite lonely on VE Day. Do you think that was true?
Yes. No, I think he was, because I think perhaps he alone was already thinking of the future and the things that still would come to haunt us, whereas everybody else was so thrilled that it was over, and all the people who worked for him were all trying to say thank you to him, and he was trying to say thank you to them. He ordered champagne to go down to the secretary's room with, I think, a gorgonzola cheese or something. But he was very aware of how many people there were to thank, but people wanted to thank him. And it's incredible to realize that almost within 6 weeks there was the election.
Churchill was on his own on VE Day because Lady Churchill was in Russia. Can you tell us why she was there?
When she went to Russia, the Prime Minister had given her a pen to give as a present, to present as a present to Marshal Stalin. And when she went to the Kremlin and presented the pen, he, not very graciously, said, "I only write with a pencil." But I think that was very significant, because after all, a pencil you can rub out.
Moving on 50 years later from the end of the war, what does it mean to you personally, this celebration of VE Day?
Well, you know, we had such extraordinary celebrations last year of the 50th anniversary, from D-Day all the way. There were 300 towns in France that celebrated last year, and I went to a lot of them, and I met with a lot of veterans. And the overwhelming reaction of the veterans to this wonderful, wonderful reception they were given. And I think it showed something which had never come out at the end of the war, which was people's personal feelings and stories about the war. Because at the end of the war, the one thing we all wanted was to put it behind us. And we didn't reminisce. And we only thought of the future and of a bright future without wars.
And professionally, as American ambassador to France, what do you feel is the significance of celebrating VE Day 50 years on?
Oh, I think it's enormously important that people remember, and that it is kept alive, the sacrifices that were made. When you think 50 years ago, so many Americans came to fight for freedom in Europe without ever having perhaps been to Europe. And this was a pledge of America to Europe that has very deep roots here, and I think last year was a very, very important moment, symbol between our country and Europe.
50 years ago, you were, in and out of Downing Street with a great wartime leader. 50 years on, you're now the American ambassador to France. Does it feel like a dream in a way? You've been sort of in the thick of it all this time.
No, I've been very privileged, and I realized on D-Day, on the 6th of June last year, when I was helicoptered at 5 in the morning in the pouring rain onto the aircraft carrier, the George Washington, to meet with the president. And it was the same kind of weather it was 50 years ago. And that I had been in London near Downing Street on that day, and to be privileged enough to be where I was 50 years later, and to see it the same and yet from such a different perspective. No, it was a great insight and a great privilege. And you know what people today forget is that everybody was so exhausted. The realization that it was what Winston Churchill had said at the beginning of the war, it will be long and it will be a perilous journey, but we will win in the end. And I think Britain never thought that they would lose the war. But nearly 6 years is a long, long time. We were very tired.